Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time that you are going to watch me. Again, my apologies for not being able to make the meeting. However, I hope that with this record and the PowerPoint presentation, you can really have a very good idea about my chapter that talks about Brazil's view of India as a diplomatic partner in world trade, particularly, of course, in the World Trade Organization, the multilateral system of trade. Let's see briefly what is strange about the partnership under a traditional interest-based account between two countries that form an alliance. And for that, let's compare briefly, before anything, Brazil's and India's stances and alliances throughout time in WTO, starting with Tokyo round in the 70s. As you know, at the time, the country was, both Brazil and India, were under an import substitution industrialization strategy. The world was very different. Both countries were leaders of the developing world. India with a more non-aligned stance, being an integral part of the non-aligned movement. However, both countries, they shared the same interest, that is, they had a defensive position against liberalization. Nonetheless, what is going on now, 30 years, more than 30 years afterwards? Now there is, rather than simply the GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, there is the World Trade Organization, and both countries are big players in the organization. Nonetheless, India is far less willing to liberalize than Brazil, particularly agriculture. India still has very defensive interests, whereas Brazil has first and foremost an offensive interest in liberalizing agricultural markets. Both countries, however, they are pretty much aligned in the process of liberalizing, or let's say dealing with the WTO. As the last Bali conference, ministerial conference in Bali, Indonesia, demonstrates. Both, okay, are emerging powers, so they can have mutual interests because of that. However, Brazil and India are not really the same sort of emerging powers. They really have interaction with the globalized world, but, well, again, in very different degrees and very different perceptions. So why such an alliance persists? If they have first those divergent interests, India is regarded as far more powerful than Brazil, given its geopolitical location, and an evidence of that is its strategic partnership with the United States. I think identity explains a lot, namely state identity. Identity that, as Kaltenstein and others would say, represents, frames the action of the country abroad. However, that identity is not stable. The current identity of Brazil is an emerging power, okay, and Brazil tends to see its interests through those lenses, even if those interests, material interests, the interests of its interest groups are not actually satisfied. And thanks for that, it tends to seek partnerships and keeps stable its partnership with India, regardless of any eventual grievances that both may have in terms of their immediate short-term interests. In order to review the argument, first I will review the literature on the topic, that is on the alliance between Brazil and India, and the WTO level, that is in what concerns trade. Afterwards, however, I also mentioned very briefly their alliance in other spheres than trade, particularly in the process of trying to reform the United Nations Security Council. Then I briefly developed a theoretical framework to explain how identities can be reframed from time to time, and therefore helping to preserve alliances. Of course, have in mind the Brazilian case vis-a-vis India. The empirical assessment, based on interviews with diplomats in both countries and archival research, demonstrates that process, that is, the move from an identity as leaders of the developing world towards emerging powers, now in the 2000s, but with an interregnum in which identities were not stable at all, and in which they started to portray opposite interests in economic terms, and therefore the conclusion. So, as you know, both are members of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, since the 40s, and although the cooperation really started in Tokyo round, or perhaps even before, but it became very clear in the Tokyo round, it was in the Uruguay round when first they really built up strength trying to block the entrance of services in the negotiations. But after, as liberalization was spread out in the world, they ended up in opposite sides, perhaps not opposite, depending on the literature that you talk about. Some people, including the diplomats themselves, would say that they took divergent paths, but not very opposite. Brazil started to side more with agricultural exporters, and India remained with stronger stances in resisting liberalization. And that, however, those positions persisted in the Doha Development Round that was launched in 2001. However, what it remains puzzling in the literature is that it's not so clear how they could build up forces again, perhaps because they are emerging powers, but okay, there's an identity thing ongoing there. However, how exactly that emerged, that is not clear. Their partnership is also evident, as I said before, in other international organizations, particularly the World, the United Nations, and it became clear as with the 2000s, they started to have a more assertive foreign policy, including building alliances with other sovereign countries, most notably South Africa, with which they formed the IPSA Forum. In terms of how to frame the question, I need a theory that helps me to link, or better said, I need a theoretical account that helps me to link the collapse of a given identity, moving towards the formation of new interests, and the crystallization of new identity that will help to frame those same interests in international negotiations. And I contend that we should look at the concept that is well developed for security studies, namely the idea of international praxis. However, it has not been used so far for economic diplomacy, as far as I know. Pretty much, as they liberalize their economies, Brazil in particular, they Brazil perceived that it couldn't really rely much on the West, and therefore it led diplomats, including presidents, to look for partnerships with Southern countries. This is a better account than the idea that both are allies because of their peripheral position in the international society, because Brazil has a dubious Western identity, whereas India has a clear stance against a Western-centered and Western-dominated world. The picture that comes up in the following slide. So, as you can see in the picture in the slide, working with a theoretical frame that contends that a systemic change triggers change, of course, in the national interest, and therefore collapse the current state identity in parallel. And that, of course, will cause demands over diplomats who have to update their practice, the practice of how they negotiate and with who and with whom they build alliances in negotiations. But that interaction ends up generating a new state identity that will in turn form new negotiations and negotiating process, how diplomats perceive the nation's interest, and also that will inherit a part of the previous state identity. And how that is translated into Brazil? Let's make an empirical assessment with the state documents from both the presidential office and the Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the interviews with diplomats, bureaucrats in both Brazil and India, as well as members of interest groups. In total, we have 56 interviews in Brazil and 44 in India. And pretty much, in fact, there is this systemic change. It's nothing new. However, it's pretty clear that the systemic change with the end of the Cold War and rise of neoliberal globalization brought to Brazil a new set of national interests related to exporting and to the need of building confidence with global centers of power. Namely the United States and the European Union, and that's evident among other facts. President Fernando Henrique Cardoso's relationships with leaders of that time in the United States, like Bill Clinton, and other European leaders like Tony Blair and Lionel Jospin in France. And that was really a process of trying to conquer credibility in order to advance Brazil's new interests. However, Brazil felt that it was being left at the margins of international society. Therefore, it had to update its diplomatic practices as it became evident in the negotiation of the free trade area of the Americas, the FTA, as well as the Mercosur-EU agreement. Insofar as those negotiations that started after the mid-90s, around the mid-90s, Brazil was very optimistic in the beginning, but after becoming more cautious, up to the point that it gave up those negotiations 10 years later, around mid-2000s, already under Lula's government. But it was under Cardoso's government in the last years, in the transition between the 20th and the 21st centuries, when this new state identity as an emerging power was created, was defined, and of course was emphasized after Lula came into power in 2003 and his emphasis on South-South politics, and gained further strength with the idea of BRICS that was put forward in the international arena. And as mentioned in the literature review, Brazil and India built up the G20 for the Doha development round, the negotiations. However, India became far more protectionist in agriculture after 2004 with the Congress-led government that had a Minister of Commerce and Chief Negotiator in WTO, Mr. Kamal Nath, portrayed on the right side of the picture that you see in the slide, with the chief negotiator from Brazil, Celso Amorim. And in 2008, that split became very clear in terms of interests, insofar as Brazil agreed with the deal that would liberalize agriculture in the long term in the developed world. However, India was against that, given the lack of protection of mechanisms to protect, under its standpoint, its peasants from the adventurous port serfs. Nonetheless, Brazil kept strongly united with India, and the Bali meeting is the last example of that. To conclude, Brazil tends to regard and praise the Eastern border and its strength, as long as, of course, it keeps its identity as an emerging power, notwithstanding minor disagreements or even big disagreements in terms of what they want in the multilateral level and what could really meet the demands of interest groups in Brazil, particularly. And the Bali Ministerial, however, postponed the negotiation of in-depth reform in agricultural trade, so it's really worth watching what will be the next steps. Probably there will be a definition until the end of 2014. And future research has to look at the domestic level, that is, how domestic conditions really reiterate or really form and contribute to build up state identities. This is something that for the sake of brevity, the framework left aside. However, it's definitely worth looking at future research. That is, diplomatic practices are not only embedded in the international context and generated with interaction with the external environment, but it also depends on the limits of domestic politics, probably.
Thank you very much. Your comments are very welcome, and again, my apologies for not being able to make it in person.